On the morning of June 7, 1935, two Mammoth Cave guides named Lyman Cutcliffe and Grover Campbell led a civilian conservation corps crew into a passage south of a limestone formation called Waldack Dome, cutting a new trail through ground that had never needed one. The air that far under Kentucky holds steady near 54 degrees no matter the season, and the men working with picks would have felt that chill settle into their hands within the hour. Then a carbide lamp caught something on a ledge 20 feet above the passage floor. An arm and a skull, pinned beneath a fallen slab of rock that had come down, by every visible sign, in a single collapse centuries before. The man had been reaching upward when the stone caught him. Nobody had moved him, buried him, or spoken his name since. What the crew found that Friday, on a morning set aside for trail work, was a miner, a man who had carried a torch and a mussel shell more than 2 miles into total dark to do work that predates every written account Kentucky has ever produced. The dome above that ledge had only carried its name a few decades at that point. Cave explorers called it Waldack Dome, after Charles Waldack, a Cincinnati photographer, who in 1866 had carried burning magnesium powder more than a mile into the cave to make the first underground photographs taken anywhere in the country, images striking enough that a fellow cave explorer named the formation after him years later. Even that story, remarkable on its own terms, was already old news to guides working the cave in 1935. What waited on the ledge above them predated Waldack's magnesium flash by something close to 4,000 years. He would come to be called Lost John. And the ledge where he died turned out to be one small point inside something far larger than anyone standing on it that morning could see, a network of ancient mineral workings that runs for miles under the ridges of south-central Kentucky, older by a comfortable margin than the first stones raised at Giza, and still, 9 decades after Cutcliffe and Campbell found him, only partly walked by anyone alive. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. What lies under that stretch of Kentucky is not one cave but a joined system of them, Mammoth Cave, Salt's Cave, and the passages between, now surveyed at slightly more than 426 miles, and still growing every year. Survey crews return to it. Long before any of that mileage was counted, before the passages even had the names they carry today, people were already deep inside them, working by cane torch, leaving behind a record scratched directly into the rock. The walls in the upper levels are scraped smooth in long overlapping strokes, the signature of someone working a soft mineral crust off stone with the sharp edge of a mussel shell, gathered from shell beds along the nearby Green River and carried in specifically for the purpose, scraping over and over for as long as it took to fill a container. The passages themselves are pure karst, limestone dissolved over millions of years by mildly acidic groundwater, into corridors, domes, and vertical shafts long before any person ever set foot inside them, which is part of why the system runs so deep and so far in every direction at once. The mineral itself is gypsum in places, and in the driest, most sheltered corridors, something rarer, mirabilite and epsomite, both sulfate salts that form naturally on cave walls where humidity and airflow hold at exactly the right balance. Radiocarbon work carried out on charcoal, cane torches, and fiber left behind by the miners has returned dates spanning more than 4,000 years ago to under 2,000 years ago, a working span most heavily concentrated in 2 long stretches, one centered a little past 4,000 years before now, the second a little past 2,200. Some of the people who did this work went deep. Survey teams have documented torch fragments and scrape marks nearly 2 miles from any entrance, a distance covered without a single artificial light source, retraced in total blackness on the way back out. The people who first entered these passages were not the last to explore them without ever finding an edge. In the 1840s, an enslaved guide named Stephen Bishop pushed past features earlier visitors had assumed, marked the limit of the known cave, and kept going, eventually producing one of the first serious interior maps built from memory and repeated exploration rather than instrument survey. In 1908, a young German engineer named Max Camper spent 8 months inside the cave working alongside a guide named Ed Bishop, and together they produced a map so detailed it remained the standard reference for the system for decades afterward. Neither man had any way of knowing how much cave lay beyond what he had personally walked. In a meaningful sense, nobody working the survey today knows that either. None of this fits comfortably into what most people picture when they hear the words ancient mine. There is no gold here, no copper, no flint worth carrying to a trading post. Mirabilite and epsomite are salts with a mild cathartic effect when eaten, useful in small doses and nothing more in large ones. Elsewhere on the continent in this same broad era, people were moving copper hundreds of miles from the shores of Lake Superior and mica from the southern Appalachians into burial grounds and trade networks that archaeologists can trace with real confidence, because copper and mica hold their shape and their shine for thousands of years and travel well. Cave salts do neither. They dissolve, they crumble, they lose whatever meaning they carried the moment they leave the dry air that preserved them. Whatever value the people who mined this material placed on it, it was not the kind of value that leaves an obvious trail on the surface. The National Park Service, which now manages the ground above every one of these passages, states plainly that the minerals collected were clearly important to the people who mined them, and states just as plainly that there is no direct evidence explaining what that use actually was. That is not a gap researchers have filled in with a plausible guess and moved on from. It is a gap the official record leaves standing, open, more than 60 years after the first serious excavation began. European settlers did not find any of this until the very end of the 1790s. A local story credits a young hunter named John Houchins, who supposedly chased a wounded bear into a hillside opening and stumbled onto the cave entrance almost by accident. The National Park Service is candid on the point today, stating plainly that there is not enough documentation to confirm the story as it has come down through local telling. What can be confirmed is only that settlers were using the entrance by the turn of the century, roughly 4,000 years after the first miners had already found the same opening, worked the passages inside it, and, by whatever measure mattered to them, finished. The first excavation, in the modern sense, began in August of 1963, when a joined team from the Illinois State Museum and the Cave Research Foundation, working with the permission of the National Park Service, entered Salt's Cave to conduct what was meant to be a short reconnaissance. It did not stay short. The archaeologist leading that team, Patty Jo Watson, working alongside her husband, the philosopher and cave scientist Richard Watson, kept returning to the same passages for the better part of a decade, and what her teams found inside changed how the whole site was understood. Intact woven moccasins, gourd containers still holding traces of what had been carried in them, bundles of unused cane torches cached and never picked back up, and, in considerable quantity, desiccated human feces, preserved by the same bone-dry air that had kept Lost John's body from decaying for roughly 2,000 years. Even that figure carries some open disagreement. Different analyses of the cloth, found loosely wrapped around his remains, have returned different centuries within that same broad window, and nobody has fully reconciled the two results. A small but honest reminder that even the most examined object recovered from this cave has not given up every answer it holds. The excavation itself was carried out under a joint arrangement between the Illinois State Museum, the Cave Research Foundation, and the National Geographic Society, formal enough in structure that its published results still anchor most academic citations on the subject more than half a century later. Watson published her findings in 2 volumes, The Prehistory of Salt's Cave, Kentucky, in 1969, and Archaeology of the Mammoth Cave Area in 1974, and a separate researcher, Richard Yarnell, spent years analyzing the paleofeces themselves, reconstructing a diet built on sunflower, goosefoot, sumpweed, maygrass, and hickory nuts with a precision that most archaeological sites never approach. The record of what these people ate is, today, almost complete. The record of why they went so deep into the dark to scrape salt off a wall is not, and Watson's own published work says so directly rather than papering over it. The institutional response to what this cave held has not always been this careful. More than a century before Watson's team arrived, during the saltpeter boom that briefly turned Mammoth Cave into a gunpowder mine for the War of 1812, workers found the mummified remains of a woman, later nicknamed Fawn Hoof, wrapped in textiles inside one of the upper chambers. In 1816, an Ohio businessman named Nahum Ward, who had seen the remains on display, petitioned the American Antiquarian Society to acquire and preserve them properly. The society declined, suspecting the whole find was a hoax. Ward bought the mummy himself instead and took her on a paid traveling exhibition across the country, the closest thing 19th century America had to a scientific record of the find, replaced, in effect, by a ticket booth. Lost John met a version of the same fate a century later. After his discovery in 1935, he was displayed first at the site where he died, and later near a formation called Giant's Coffin, viewed by tourists for decades as a fixture of the tour route rather than a subject of ongoing study. In the 1970s, the National Park Service reburied him without public announcement. The location chosen is known today only to the park superintendent and a small number of people inside the agency. A discovery that had been public property for 40 years became, by administrative decision, unreachable again, and the record of exactly where he now rests is not something the public record contains at all. Salt's Cave and the mined levels of Mammoth Cave are not an isolated pocket of this behavior. Two other sites in the same limestone belt of south-central Kentucky carry a related signature, though not identical. Fisher Ridge Cave, in the same county as Salt's Cave, holds charcoal pictographs, geometric cross-hatching, spirals, and figures drawn deep inside its passages by people working from the same cultural horizon, using the same cane torches for light. Crump's Cave, roughly 40 miles to the southwest in Warren County, shows a similar layer of prehistoric use, marked walls and worked passages that state archaeologists have documented and continue to protect under permit. A third site, Adair Glyph Cave in Adair County, adds another layer to the same picture. Its walls carry petroglyphs of a turtle, a horned lizard, and a figure that may be a spider or a person holding a torch, cut by hand into stone in absolute darkness by people who had no obvious reason to expect that another living person would ever stand where they stood to see them. Dating this kind of cave art precisely is difficult work, since the marks themselves carry no organic material a laboratory can test, and researchers have generally had to rely on the surrounding cultural layer instead, which is one more piece of this record that stays open rather than closed. Neither site shows mining on the scale found at Salt's Cave. What they share instead is a pattern of deliberate, repeated, physically demanding entry into total darkness by people who left behind evidence of exactly how far they went and almost nothing explaining why they kept going back. The state's own Office of State Archaeology now requires a permit for any archaeological investigation inside a Kentucky cave, a restriction applied evenly across all of them, Salt's Cave included, treating every one of these sites as an active and unresolved part of the record, rather than a settled one. That pattern of restriction extends to the objects these caves have already given up. The moccasins found in Salt's Cave, among the clearest surviving examples of what a prehistoric miner actually wore into the dark, were recovered in the mid-1920s by a small caving party that included Andy Collins, brother of the cave explorer Floyd Collins, whose own death in nearby Sand Cave in 1925 became one of the most widely reported news stories in the country that year. A 1973 letter from one of the party's members, Roy Owsley, records the trip in plain, first-person detail, the names scratched into the wall by earlier visitors, the branching passages they explored for hours by lamp. The moccasins themselves eventually entered the collection of the Kentucky Museum at Western Kentucky University, where they remain today, one of the few artifacts from this mining tradition that the public can actually walk up to and see with their own eyes, rather than read about in a catalogue. The passages Watson's team surveyed in the 1960s were only a small fraction of what the connected cave system actually contains, and how much larger that system truly is has only become clear since. Mammoth Cave first entered the record books in 1969, with 65 miles of documented passage. On September 9, 1972, a six-person team from the Cave Research Foundation spent 12 hours underground and found the connection linking the Mammoth Cave system to the neighboring Flint Ridge system, a discovery led into its final chamber by caver John Wilcox, bringing the combined total to 144 miles and making it for the first time the longest known cave system on Earth. It has held that title every year since, and it has not stopped growing. The Cave Research Foundation, an all-volunteer organization founded in 1957, has continued mapping new passage nearly every season since the connection was made, adding 8 more miles in a single survey push in September of 2021 alone. The system now stands surveyed at more than 426 miles, and the United States Department of the Interior has stated publicly that as many as 600 additional miles may exist beyond that figure, in passages connected to the known system but not yet entered, mapped, or named by anyone. Rick Toomey, the park's cave resource management specialist, has said without qualification that without the volunteer surveys of the past 6 decades, Mammoth Cave would likely still be recorded as little more than a 44-mile system. The rest, by his own account, is still out there, unmapped, unentered, and unaccounted for. Each survey season, the Cave Research Foundation publishes an updated total, and for more than 2 decades running now, that total has moved in only one direction, upward, never once settling on a final number anyone has been willing to call complete. Somewhere inside that unmapped remainder, if the pattern documented in the surveyed sections holds, there is more of what Lyman Cutliff and Grover Campbell found in 1935. More scrape marks, more cached torches, more ledges nobody has stood on since the ceiling settled and sealed a passage shut. No agency has claimed otherwise, and no survey team has ever reported reaching a wall that felt like the actual end of it. Every season, the Cave Research Foundation sends volunteers back in with the same basic instruments the discipline has used for decades: tape, compass, clinometer, and the same basic question nobody has ever been able to answer for certain: how much more is actually down here? If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The mining did not end because the cave ran out of material. Gypsum and mirabilite still form on those walls today, the same slow mineral bloom that drew people into the dark more than 4,000 years ago. What ended, sometime within the early woodland period, a little over 2,000 years back by the radiocarbon record, was the practice itself, and the record offers no clean explanation for that either. Watson's excavations found no sign of violence, no burned layer, no single event marking the end. The skeletal remains recovered from the cave over the decades of work show no unhealed trauma consistent with conflict. Only the ordinary wear a body accumulates from years of hard physical labor performed in a crouch, by torchlight, on stone. The deep passages simply stop showing fresh scrape marks and fresh torch caches after a certain point, the way a well-worn trail stops showing footprints once the people using it move somewhere else. The same centuries saw agriculture across the Ohio and Green River valleys shift toward the crops that would eventually feed the large mound building societies farther east. Whether that shift explains the end of the cave mining is not something the excavation record settles, and nobody who has published on the site claims otherwise. What they left behind did not go anywhere. Unused caches of cane torches and fiber sandals still sit in side passages close enough to the modern tour route that present-day visitors on ranger-led walks pass within a few feet of them, marked and protected rather than removed. In the Salts Cave vestibule, the wide entrance chamber where the earliest and heaviest concentration of activity took place, the paleofeces record Watson's team recovered remains one of the most detailed dietary archives from any prehistoric site in North America, still being reanalyzed by researchers using methods that did not exist when it was first excavated. Faunhoof, the mummy Nahum Ward carried on tour, instead of preserving through the American Antiquarian Society, disappeared from any documented public record after roughly 1816, her final resting place, as unrecorded today as the man who found her. And Lost John, the miner whose arm was still reaching upward when Lyman Cutliffe's carbide lamp found him, rests now in ground the National Park Service has chosen not to disclose, a decision made not by the people who mined this cave but by the agency that now manages the hole in the record where their explanation should be. Mammoth Cave has since been named a United Nations World Heritage Site in 1981, an International Biosphere Reserve 9 years after that, and an International Dark Sky Park in 2021, a stack of formal protections that would have meant nothing at all to the people who once worked these walls by torchlight, and that have still not resulted in every corner of the place being seen by anyone alive today. None of this required a hidden hand to produce it. No agency erased a civilization, and no single researcher buried a discovery to protect a reputation. What produced this gap is more ordinary, and in its own way more unsettling. A society spent close to 2,000 years performing an enormous, physically punishing, clearly organized act of extraction, in absolute darkness, far past the point where anyone above ground was checking on them, and never left behind a single account of why. Every other detail survived: their diet, their footwear, their tools, their route through the passages measured almost to the yard. The one thing that did not survive is the reason, and no excavation in more than 60 years of careful work has recovered it. Stand today at the historic entrance where prehistoric people first walked in, by the earliest radiocarbon estimates close to 5,000 years ago, and the 426 surveyed miles behind that opening stretch, out in the dark exactly as they have for millennia, mapped in places, silent in most of the rest. Somewhere past the last line any survey crew has drawn, the Department of the Interior's own estimate of several hundred additional unmapped miles is still sitting there, untouched by any light stronger than what a person can carry on their back. Lyman Cutliff and Grover Campbell walked into that darkness on a Friday in 1935, expecting to cut a trail, and instead found a man who had walked the same darkness with nothing but a mussel shell and a torch, doing work that has outlasted every explanation anyone has offered for it since. The cave has given back his tools, his diet, his route, and his resting place, in that order, one at a time, over 90 years. It has never given back the reason he was there. Visitors who take the ranger-led tour past Waldack Dome today walk the same graded trail the Civilian Conservation Corps cut that summer, lit now by electric bulbs instead of carbide lamps, the temperature still holding at its steady 54 degrees regardless of the season outside. Most of them never learn that the ledge above the trail once held a man who died reaching upward, or that the passage they are standing in is a single mapped thread inside a system that may still be, by the government's own estimate, less than half discovered. The cave does not announce any of this. It only has to keep the record the way it has always kept it, patient, dark, and complete, except for the one page nobody has found yet. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you loved this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.